Hollywood has had its fair share of disasters, but one film is widely thought of as the benchmark of costly mistakes. Thanks to a grueling press cycle and the resulting rumor mill, many would have you believe that Waterworld was one of the most expensive fiascos in film history. But was it really? Waterworld was a harrowing journey to put on screen, flush with the drama of its lead actor feuding with his director and the pricey insanity of making a movie entirely on the ocean. Despite that, calling it a box office bomb isn't quite accurate. But yes, it was an absolute shit show.
Russ, what he's gonna do his mind? He's out of his mind completely, Russ.
For a film as historically expensive as Waterworld, it's incredibly ironic that it actually first set sail as a bargain bin Roger Corman B-movie. In 1986, Hollywood was still churning out knockoffs of George Miller's action classic Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior. And Corman was looking to produce his own version, but of course, on the cheap. Writer Peter Rader was tasked with coming up with an original take on the post-apocalyptic trope.
I wasn't really willing to just rehash that genre without some kind of cool variation. And you know, I was doing some sailing at the time, and I was walking around a marina, and I was like, that's it. On water. Let's set it on water.
Rader pitched a world after the polar ice caps had all melted, and Earth became one giant ocean, leaving humanity as drifters on their man-made islands. Rader was rejected instantly.
And he was like, are you out of your goddamn mind? A movie like that? What's that? What's that going to cost us? $5 million. It's a no, pass, you know. And I said, well, you know what? I still like that idea a lot, and I'm going to go write it. Little did I know that it would become the most expensive movie in history.
Unrestrained by budget, Rader penned a huge, colorful epic filled with Western imagery, Greek mythology, and religious iconography. From the search of the fabled Mount Ararat to the trident-wielding villain Neptune sitting on his clamshell throne. Our lone hero, with his bulky river barge retrofitted with a sail and cannons, and his literal white horse companion, is racing to find dry land. The script ends with the reveal that the last remaining piece of solid ground is Mount Everest. Rader sat on the script until 1988, when it ended up in the hands of producers Andy Licht and Jeff Mueller. They had just produced their first film, License to Drive, and were working on their second, Little Monsters. But they wanted to flex their muscles with something bigger. Looking at Waterworld, they discussed endlessly with Rader about how they could feasibly and safely make a film of this size on water. They forecast a $30 million picture, but at that price, they would need more experienced producers to make the film a reality. They teamed up with brothers Larry and Chuck Gordon, who among many things were producers on the Die Hard and Predator franchises. By 1991, the Gordons had hooked Universal Pictures, and Kevin Costner was circling the project. Knowing the scale of the movie, Universal wanted a seasoned director, specifically Robert Zemeckis. However, Costner's involvement was contingent on his choice, Kevin Reynolds. The problem was, Reynolds had it in his contract that he would cast any actor in his films not named Kevin Costner.
Sit back.
The Kevins became friends in 1985 after Costner was cast in Reynolds' first feature, Fandango. Years later, while Costner was directing his first film, Dances with Wolves, he asked for Reynolds' help, mostly with the overwhelming buffalo hunt scene. All bets were against Costner during the movie's arduous production, yet he proved everyone wrong with the instant classic, which won 7 Academy Awards, including 2 for Costner, Best Director and Best Picture. While he didn't thank Reynolds, he did say this.
Everyone knows that you really don't make pictures by yourself, and I accept this tonight on behalf of my friends.
Costner was already an A-listed star, but now he was a powerhouse in Hollywood, rivaling the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Tom Cruise. Then came Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves in '91. Costner, as a producer, handpicked Reynolds to direct. And it was here when their friendship fractured, after multiple on-set arguments such as Costner's insistence on attempting an English accent, much to the annoyance of his director.
They got armor pull? Even this boy can be taught to find the chinks in every suit of armor.
And why should the people listen to you?
Because, unlike some other Robin Hoods, I can speak with an English accent.
When they reached the editing room, Costner felt he was being upstaged by Alan Rickman and demanded that his scenes get cut down.
No more merciful beheadings. And call off Christmas.
Reynolds refused, but Costner pulled rank and forced the changes. A furious Reynolds simply quit, leaving Costner, the film, and their friendship far behind. Seeing as how successful the movie was, to the studios, it was proof yet again to trust Costner's instincts. Once Waterworld came around, the Gordons thought the Kevins were the right men for the job. They convinced them to sit down together and squash their beef.
When do you want me to serve the squash and the beef?
So we're literally serving squash and beef?
You said we're squashing beef. I thought it would be part of the ceremony to have squash and beef.
It worked, so the Kevins decided to test their new truce with Costner offering to produce Reynolds' next film, Rapa Nui. That production was a total shit show for Reynolds, but none of that had to do with Costner. The two of them came out of it still friendly, and they decided to power through another studio tentpole together, with Reynolds updating his contract from not casting Costner to not letting Costner have final cut. Officially on board for Waterworld, the Kevins started making sweeping changes. Peter Rader, now 7 drafts in, was asked politely to step aside so a new writer could offer a fresh perspective. Of the many who provided rewrites, The Fugitive's David Twohy made the most substantial revisions. A majority of the fantastical elements were stripped from the story, grounding it in a dirty aesthetic, much like Mad Max. But no horse, as Reynolds knew that would be logistically insane to film. Gills were added to the Mariner, he became more of a recluse who wasn't interested in the search for dry land, and his river barge was replaced with a more agile trimaran. As the budget increased to $65 million, producers Andy Licht and Jeff Mueller felt their concerns for shooting on water were being ignored. But when they spoke up, Universal forced them to leave, threatening to blackball them from the studio if they didn't. While they managed to maintain their executive producing credits, they now believe Waterworld's wild production was a bullet worth dodging. They moved on to make Ben Stiller's The Cable Guy.
Dry land is not a myth! I've seen it! Kevin Costner, Waterworld!
When the start date drew closer, the Kevins returned to their bickering ways. Reynolds wanted to make an action film that would rival anything made in the last decade. Costner wanted a more meaningful character piece that focused on his hero. A last-ditch effort by Costner was to hire Joss Whedon, a go-to script doctor at the time, who would be on set to punch up the dialogue and solve their incomplete third act. The disagreement led to an unfinished script only days before filming. The filmmakers decided to shoot in Kauai Harbor on the north end of the Big Island of Hawaii. On one hand, it was a boon for the Hawaiian economy from the hundreds of jobs it created, to Universal directly funding an expansion of the Kona airport. On the other hand, local contractors knew they were the only option for the studio. They nickeled and dimed the production, driving up the cost on everything from materials to transportation. By the time filming actually began, Waterworld's budget had ballooned to $100 million. A vast majority of the production's financial and physical cost centered around the enormous floating atoll set. In order to accommodate the Mariner's trimaran, the atoll had to be scaled up and it became as wide as a football stadium. It was made of wood, paper mache, and an ungodly amount of steel, built in sections allowing them to tow each piece separately and reassemble it all on the open ocean. It contained functional bathrooms where the sewage needed to be pumped out regularly, and its anchors could be adjusted, allowing the entire structure to rotate so the camera wouldn't see land. The set was initially budgeted at $1 million, but had jumped to $5 million by completion.
Nothing's free in Waterworld.
Thanks to its large walls, lots of the scenes could be filmed in the safety of the harbor. But once it was hauled out to sea, that's when things really spiraled out of control. The day before their June 1994 start date, the cast and crew attended a blessing of the site by a Kahuna high priest, hoping to bestow a good omen upon production. Little did they know that Kauai High roughly translates to water of wrath, and no amount of Universal's money was going to calm the rough seas ahead. Kevin Reynolds was even advised by his former mentor to reconsider.
But I called Steven Spielberg when I decided I wanted to do this, and I asked him, I said, look, there's this project Waterworld, it's all set on the ocean, and you did Jaws, and do I really want to do this? And he goes, you may. He said, I would never work on the water again. Again, you're still in that mode as a young filmmaker, like I can overcome anything. And, I didn't heed his advice.
Filming on Waterworld was bonkers. Reynolds, in his own words, said production wasn't a 3-ring circus, it was a 12-ring circus. Everything Spielberg endured on Jaws, Reynolds experienced tenfold. The cast and crew constantly got seasick, the sun and clouds caused lighting inconsistencies, they stopped for any rain, the wind and waves would ruin starting positions of all boats involved, and background mountains and shipping vessels would spoil shots that would later need to be digitally removed. A luxury they didn't have on Jaws, but in this case, it was another costly expense. Computers and generators were stolen. There were frequent firings and crew walkouts as high up as special effects supervisors and an assistant director. And while Spielberg only captained a small fleet of 3 or 4 ships, Reynolds was an admiral to a hulking armada. The attack on the atoll, which took over a month to film, required a multitude of ships, barges, jet skis, crew vessels, camera boats, helicopters, and why not, a seaplane. Single shots and stunts required hours to reset, from replacing the bullet squibs that explode underwater, to a plane dragging water skiers who were actually being pulled by a helicopter while a second helicopter filmed it.
And then we got the helicopter going so that we guys learned to water ski behind the helicopters. And then Craig Hoskin has to come in the seaplane and get right alongside the helicopter to mask it, to tie everything together. These guys on the skis were skiing for miles. It wasn't done in a couple hundred yards. I mean, we're talking miles, multiple miles, everybody hanging on, doing 60 miles an hour across the ocean. It was amazing.
Even the simple task of ferrying everyone out to the set lasted all morning, and they would break for lunch as soon as they all got there. And if they didn't get fed, Universal had to pay union fines upwards of $2 million.
What for?
So we can get something to eat?
We ate 2 days ago.
You ate!
If things weren't just expensive or troublesome, they became dangerous. Since the atoll was made in parts and floating on the ocean, it was extremely unsteady, leading to dozens of accidents and injuries a day. Stars Jean Triplehorn and Tina Majorino were on the bow of the trimaran when the handrails snapped, dropping them into the water, and they were nearly run over by the very boat they were just on. Jellyfish were so rampant that Costner started calling Majorino jellyfish candy because she was stung so many times. As for the movie star, to get one aerial shot, Costner stood atop the sail of the trimaran when a windstorm hit. The mast swayed back and forth as Costner held on for dear life, putting him closer and closer to the blades of the filming helicopter. When the safety crew called cut, they had to sail for another half hour before it was safe enough for Costner to climb down. The worst accident was Costner's stunt double, who, while filming the underwater kiss, surfaced too quickly without exhaling and suffered an embolism caused by decompression sickness.
If you'll notice the arterial nature of the blood coming from the hole in my head, you can assume that we're all having a real lousy day.
These issues aside, as a film, Waterworld's biggest problems arose from the competing visions of Reynolds and Costner over that incomplete script. Costner wanted his Mariner to be a confident, swashbuckling hero, while Reynolds wanted a jaded, pessimistic one. This led to a performance awkwardly stuck between the two.
If I let you out of here, you're taking us with you.
Sure.
The Kevins' relationship was at first described as frustrating but tolerable, with only the occasional storming off set by Costner. But as the tension boiled back up, Costner publicly announced he was getting divorced from his wife of 16 years. Reynolds, who previously went through his own divorce, sympathized with Costner. The men once again shelved their disagreements to finish the movie. As the prolonged shoot pushed production into hurricane season, with multiple days lost due to storm warnings, Universal grew tired of the constant headaches and wanted cuts to the script.
You guys are in so much trouble.
Costner was still passionate that Waterworld could work as is. To appease their financial worries, he waived his 15% cut of the film's gross. Don't worry, he still got his $12.5 million starring fee. In return, he asked Universal to trust him and the changes being made by Whedon. Yet Whedon, years removed, said none of his suggestions were ever used. He was hired for 1 week but stayed for another 6, practically dictating only Costner's ideas. When it came to the film's climax, the Kevins had yet to agree on one from the various drafts. Most had a showdown on the beaches of the newly discovered dry land. Others had it aboard an oil tanker. Whedon argued neither worked, as the highlight should be the mariners' aquatic skills, which would mean more filming on water. Sick of the cost overruns and dealing with the ocean, it was decided to move production to LA to finish the movie in water tanks and controlled environments, including a finale on the Exxon Valdez, where the surrounding ocean was added digitally. Production came to a merciful end in early 1995.
Oh, thank God.
All in all, Waterworld went from its planned 96-day shoot to a grueling 166 days. Universal wanted to release the film that upcoming summer. However, seeing as how the production went so far beyond schedule, they slashed Reynolds' editing time from 10 weeks to 5. When Reynolds handed in his first cut, it was considered too slow and dreary, especially with Mark Isham's somber score. It was also nearly 3 hours long, and the studio demanded it come in at 2 hours and 15 minutes. Reynolds knew the scenes Universal wanted to pull out would create plot holes. His suggested changes to patch those holes and get the runtime down would include reshoots.
Well, that's a quaint suggestion, but it don't really play here.
Obviously, Universal wasn't eager to dive back into the waters of wrath, and the delay would make them miss a summer release. Furthermore, Costner was worried that the cuts would force the film to be wall-to-wall action. His chief concern was his character. For Reynolds, it was the story. Their truce began to break.
You're pretty stingy for a man who's got everything, aren't you, then?
Costner pulled rank again and wanted a day alone in the editing room. Reynolds cautiously agreed as long as Universal allowed him to cut his own version for the Directors Guild. But that day turned into a week, and the studio said there wouldn't be time for Reynolds' DGA cut.
What? God damn it! Beef! No, I got beef with that!
Universal was now fully behind their star instead of their director. It was the last straw for Reynolds, and history repeated itself. He left 2 months before release. Then came the public back and forth war of words between the Kevins. Calling Reynolds irresponsible for walking, leaving him to finalize the edit, Costner said he made a huge mistake ever working with Reynolds, that they were never really friends, that he protected Reynolds throughout production yet received no thanks for his sacrifices, and for good measure trashed Reynolds' film Rapa Nui. Not wanting to be the scapegoat, Reynolds called out Costner, putting the blame solely on him, then fired back. In the future, Costner should only appear in pictures he directs himself. That way he can always be working with his favorite actor and his favorite director.
I feel like we're just creating more beefs.
Which we will not resolve. Beefs are best left simmering under the surface. I've learned that now.
Best thing to do with a beef, jam it deep down inside and then press forward.
Perhaps time heals all wounds, seeing how in 2012, Costner produced Hatfields and McCoys, a 3-part miniseries about the legendary American Western feud, and he appropriately turned to Kevin Reynolds to direct it. The two men had spent over a decade working through their issues, but as Costner said, out of their tumultuous fire comes creative steel. The series was a big hit and earned Costner an Emmy for lead actor. And while he didn't thank Reynolds, he did say this.
I just have to say that just looking at this thing, it reminds me a little bit of the Olympics, you know, the Olympic sports in London, but it doesn't seem like much of a sport, you know.
What?
With Reynolds gone and Isham alongside him, replaced by James Newton Howard, Costner and Universal cut Waterworld down to 2 hours and 15 minutes, losing the usual stuff like world building, character motivations, and plot points. They also removed the Mount Everest shot, which was the twist that sold Reynolds on the screenplay in the first place.
Was this your big vision?
All of which would be reinstated when it reached, oddly enough, broadcast television, but not on DVD until 2008 with the extended edition, thanks in large part to Universal's jealousy of seeing a 3-hour fan edit get shared widely across the internet. To top it all off, the film includes the first digital Universal Pictures logo, which also became one of the longest and most expensive CG shots in film history. But what's a few million more? The lead up to Waterworld's release was flooded with nothing but bad press. Journalists had been writing about all the problems for months, almost enjoying spreading the gossip, Like Chum in the Water, the drama was too good not to print. They started calling the film Kevin's Gate, after the infamous bomb Heaven's Gate, which collapsed an entire studio. But many stories were completely unfounded, from a claim that extras didn't have access to bathrooms, to Costner demanding a VFX company do digital touch-ups to his balding scalp.
That makes you even more angry that perhaps there might be some people that won't ever get to see this movie based on what some idiot said.
When the small slavers outpost capsized during a storm, mostly because of how top-heavy it was widely reported that the entire $5 million atoll sank, a myth continually repeated by many to this day, including this idiot.
A giant storm tore through the atoll, sinking the $5 million set.
What are you thinking about?
Even with everything discussed so far, it's hard to parse fact from fiction.
I mean, I'll give you an example of the kind of stuff that happened. I was going to do a shot where I put a camera crew up on top of the mast on the trimaran. We go out there, we anchor, we're setting a position, and a swell comes up. So I turned to the boat guy and I said, "Bruno, is this safe?" And he looks at it and he goes, "No." I said, "We're going to have to break out of the setup and do something else. We'll lose another half day." Okay, well, the next day, the publicity guy gets his phone call. So they go, "Okay, don't lie to us. We've had this confirmed by 2 separate sources. We want to know about the 2 camera guys that were killed yesterday in the accident." He goes, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Don't lie to us. We know this happened and you're trying to cover it up." This was what we faced.
Waterworld's final budget topped at a whopping $175 million, easily becoming the most expensive movie ever made, blowing past the previous record holder, James Cameron's $115 million True Lies. It became the straw man to how Hollywood was letting budgets get out of control. If they only knew. The fervor only grew when David Twohy wrote an open letter telling the industry to stop judging the film before seeing it, but also that they should applaud studios gambling on big projects, as successful movies fund smaller films. Universal avoided wading into the controversy, as they were in the midst of a corporate merger and wanted to appear financially responsible. But truth was, because of that merger, they weren't focusing on Waterworld's escalating budget as much as they probably should have been. Universal also knew that a lot of the money would come further down the line, via toys, VHS sales and rentals, TV licensing, a never-ending theme park attraction, and video games.
Game over. Please deposit 40 quarters.
What a rip!
By the time Waterworld washed ashore on July 28, 1995, audiences had already heard so many discouraging stories it led to a modest opening weekend and so-so reviews. While it is a beautiful, bombastic, entertaining action flick, the pulling of 2 different creative forces can be felt and plot holes abound. And 14 years removed, it does seem like a carbon copy of The Road Warrior. Which, to be fair, was the original intent. Hell, they share the same director of photography, Dean Semler. The film finished its domestic run with a grim $88 million, barely half of the film's oversized budget. Universal believes the negative publicity cost them upwards of $50 million. And this is why so many remember Waterworld as one of the biggest flops of all time. But was it actually? Regardless of its quality, Waterworld's legacy marks a significant change within the industry. Hollywood was rapidly expanding outside of the United States, and it allowed studios to rely on the global box office to offset lackluster domestic showings. As much as Waterworld's reputation has most believing it bombed, in reality, its worldwide gross of $264 million was decent. And when it hit home video, it turned a good profit, just as Universal hoped. But as they say,
when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Despite all the evidence to the contrary, for many, it's apparently more fun to think of Waterworld as an expensive failure than a moderate success. But as one Universal executive said, for some, the making of the film will always be more interesting than the movie itself.
I don't know what all the fuss was about! I saw that movie 6 times! It ruled!